Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Polymath World channel, where we're talking to academics and scientists and engineers and researchers and astronauts from all kinds of different fields about their discipline and about work on the frontiers of human knowledge. And I'm delighted today to be doing another one on philosophy with a new friend of mine who I've had the pleasure of getting to know just up the road from me in Oxford, Dr Amna Whiston. It's wonderful to be with you today. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Sam, for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I had the pleasure of working with you last month, and you did some debates with Professor Alex Carter on artificial intelligence. And it really struck me, the breadth of your work in philosophy, and I thought we have to have this conversation. So why don't you tell us who you are and what you do?
Well, I am a philosopher specializing in ethics and philosophy of mind. I have not always been a philosopher, or perhaps I should say I have always been a philosopher, because to illustrate, my dear mother, who sadly passed away 2 weeks ago, used to say to me when I was maybe 10 or 8, stop philosophizing. And what I realize now, as I go older, that she didn't mean to discourage me from philosophizing. On the contrary, she was recognizing the fact that I was doing it, even at that young age. But I did not pursue philosophy professionally till I was in my late 30s, actually. And so my background is I'm from Sarajevo, which used to be part of Yugoslavia. Now it's Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I came to UK maybe something like 6 months before the conflict started in Bosnia. And I had to just reorganize myself. I was studying economics, which I really did not like at all. And I completed the first 2 years, and I decided to take a break and come to England. And the rest of is history. So I stayed here and I got married and had a career, publishing career. I had children and sort of publishing career, managing things, as best as I could. And then suddenly, sort of towards the end of my publishing career, I was working in a publicity department. I was head of PR department. And my last book was a wonderful book by Stephen Law, who you're acquainted with. And it was called The War for Children's Minds. And it was kind of that Kantian take on, this kind of appeal for future generations to take ownership of their own thoughts, something like that. And I was really pleased that was my last book my last project that I worked on. But during that time, lots of publishing houses, and in this case, Routledge, were undergoing transformations and mergers, etc. So my department was made redundant. And that was such a blessing. My whole department closed down because they obviously offered me quite a good deal. And I was very happy to take it, because at that very crucial point, I realized that I can no longer run away from philosophy because it's just following me. And as I illustrated, by briefly summarizing Stephen Law's book, The War for Children's Minds, I was fortunate in Routledge to work with lots of really good philosophers and inspiring philosophers, including the late Mary Midgley, who was such a great publishing experience for me. Yeah. Nonetheless, so I moved across, and I did 2 masters in 2 years at University of Reading. Sounds familiar to you, Sam?
Yeah, love that.
So the first one was political theory, and the second one was philosophy. And then after that, I did a PhD in philosophy, which I didn't complete that long ago. 7-8 years ago, something like that. So since I've just been working full-time as a philosophy tutor and researcher, and I'm very happy to be where I am.
That's wonderful. So I got a couple of questions there. Firstly, were you one of those children that was just always asking why, like, but why? To the madness of their parents. That was sort of your philosophical child experience.
Well, yes, partly, but also now kind of thinking back, I think I always had this sort of Hegelian thing in my mind before I even read any Hegel, that, everything is and isn't at the same time. Today's, now it's like 11 o'clock here, but somewhere else it isn't. So that's kind of the dialectic was always tormenting in a sense, that I could not really understand why am I puzzled with these questions? Why is the world in the way it is? And why we ask these questions that endlessly that we just cannot have a clear answer to. And that's the beauty of philosophy, kind of keep asking better and better questions rather than reaching the final destination, and that's it.
Yeah, I think in that sense, philosophy is just an innate human subject that it just comes naturally to children, and we either squash it or we open it up. And thankfully for many of us, it's been opened up. You also mentioned getting 2 masters in 2 years. Were you doing 2 full-time 1-year masters, or were you doing them simultaneously?
No, I was doing them separately. So 1 year, the first year was the political theory, and the second one was philosophy masters. So yes, I mean I kind of learned a little bit more after the first master. The masters that I really wanted to go further than just doing masters. And because I don't have an undergraduate degree in philosophy, it made perfect sense to do the second one, which then was sufficient to pursue the PhD.
Yeah. So your master's in philosophy, was it quite broad? Were you studying multiple things within it? And what did you do your dissertation on?
So I was always interested in moral motivation, and a sort of this debate about whether reason by itself can motivate action, or whether, on the contrary, in addition to our cognitive capacities, we have to be also motivated by our desires, by our emotions, etc. So, and relatedly, that invites kind of these questions that cognitivist and non-cognitivist in moral philosophy have been asking for a very long time. What does it mean to make a moral judgment? Is moral judgment a kind of belief, or is it more like a desire? So, so part of my master's was really focusing on that cognitivist, non-cognitivist debate. Whether the second part of that debate, obviously, is the metaphysical one, is the question of whether there are moral facts out there, or whether perhaps, as error theorists argue, yes, we are making moral judgments are cognitive states, typically beliefs, but we're always misfiring, so there are no such facts, and we cannot just not think in this way because that's how we are made, sort of thing. So yeah, that was kind of pretty much the focus on my second master's, the questions about the nature of moral judgment and motivation.
Amazing. I can't wait to get into that. Reading is a wonderful university. I know I'm very biased.
Absolutely.
I'm there now. I'm not in philosophy. I'm doing DNA repair and genetics. But
Yes.
but Anthony Blue was at Reading. A lot of great people have been there. It's a wonderful university to study, and I really recommend it to
Yes.
people. Did you do your PhD at Reading as well?
I did indeed, yes. So I was very fortunate to work with some very, very inspiring philosophers that include the late Professor Philip Stratton Lake, who passed away a few years ago, who was one of my PhD supervisors. And my second supervisor is also a very, very inspiring philosopher, Max de Gainsford, who specializes in philosophy of mind and philosophy of language, but who actually drew my attention to sometimes when you write, you're not so much aware that you're heading in a certain direction. And that's exactly what happened. He pointed out to me, but look, the way you write about moral sort of ethical issues is touching on the philosophy of mind questions, kind of the nature of belief, the nature of moral belief, the nature of emotions, and the role of emotions in moral conduct. So subsequently, as I said, I was very fortunate to be guided by these two special philosophers who were my PhD supervisors, and my master's supervisor, who left Reading. He's an air theorist. I should mention him too, Bart Stromer. He left the first year of my PhD, which is when Max de Gainsford took over, and so that was my my PhD thesis was shaping, in that way that it became sort of intersection between philosophy of mind, moral philosophy, and a little bit of neuroscience, because I was interested in that kind of import of scientific import and the new discoveries by neuroscientists, most prominently Damasio and his work. So that was my PhD at Reading time, which was a long time because I was still working part-time and had 2 children and family. So it was slower than I wanted, but eventually I got there.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat right now. Finishing one at the start of another while having 3 children, and
Wow.
I gotta ask you here. I wasn't awarded my first degree until I was 35. I'm 41
Right.
now, and I've got 9 of them, so it's like quite mad. But
You have 9 what? Sorry.
I've got 9 university qualifications. 2
Wow.
undergraduate degrees, 4 masters, 2 PhDs, 2 certificates. So no one should do that. No one should ever do that. That's too much.
And you're only 41.
Yeah, we're the Polymath World channel for a reason.
Right.
Did you find the experience of studying philosophy much richer coming to it later in life than perhaps you might have if you just went in as an 18-year-old?
I think that is right. I mean, opinions varies, and some people would say, well, the young minds, they are not fully shaped and formed, so they absorb more, and they are just in a better position epistemologically to achieve, to achieve whatever they want to achieve philosophically, academically, than when you start like myself and you, although you started earlier in terms of, how old were you when you gain, all of these 9 qualifications. But I feel that this is right for me. So perhaps it is partly subjective. There's no kind of all fit, one formula. So perhaps, for people like me and you, it is better to more seriously pursue this kind of career later in life than earlier.
Yeah, and
you
you work now with Stephen Law at Oxford
Mm-hmm.
University. in the
Yes.
continuing education. Do you do work elsewhere as well, or is it I can't say is it just Oxford, because it's Oxford University, one of the best universities in the world. But do you also teach elsewhere?
Yes, so in addition to Oxford University Department for Continuing Education, I work with Alex Carter in the University of Cambridge continuing education, now professional and continuing education.
Yes.
And typically I supervise the students who are doing the diplomas, certificates in research and art and theory, research and theory and practice. So that is a really nice job to do. So, I mean, it doesn't occupy more than maybe 20% of my working time, but it is nice to do that. As a third thing, I work for an organization called Oxford Prospects, and they are facilitating the study abroad program, mostly with higher education institutions in China, in the UK. So I have done, so over the probably past 7 years, maybe, I've done lectures, seminars, online tutorials, face-to-face lectures, because they have some programs as well. But when I first started working for them, I was approached following the lecture on, I can't remember what the lecture was on. I was approached, that was probably just a year after I did my Viva, and they invited me. That would have been a postdoc, which I, didn't have. They invited me to Jilin University in China to teach undergraduates Kant's philosophy for 6 months. And I was very happy to do that. And during the process of them, sorting out my visa application, we reached the point when they were just about to book my flight to Jilin, and guess what happened? Just
COVID?
Before they booked the flight, hit the lockdown, the first lockdown. So I never went. But, had they done all of this maybe 4 weeks earlier, I would have ended up in lockdown in China.
Gosh, yes.
Which, yes, it's just really strange.
Yeah. Well, this is really great. I mean, you're teaching as a tutor or a lecturer at both Oxford and Cambridge, in the continuing education. So you're teaching mature students, which is wonderful. Yeah, it's a great joy,
absolutely.
great experience. And so we've been through your career journey. I'd like to talk about your research and your research interests now, and they're very clearly set out in ethics and philosophy of mind. And I'm quite interested in the areas of intersection that you might have there. But could you've already told us a little bit about the moral motivations aspect, but could you tell us a bit about your research on ethics?
Research on it. So my primary question is about the role of emotion in moral conduct. And that brings a more kind of preliminary question, namely a question about the nature of emotion itself. Now, as we know, Plato has, left us for many, many years and centuries, in fact, with this kind of devastating possibility that emotion is just a feeling that can overwhelm us, that we need to be in control of, that we need to, to the extent that we are rational, we control of our emotions, according to Plato's philosophy. Of course, what happened, much later, on the part of philosophical research as well as scientific research, people that I mentioned before, most prominently, Damasio, have discovered the way in which the emotional and reasoning processes are intertwined, inseparable, in other words. And that kind of forced philosophers, at least some philosophers, to have revised the conceptual schemes and to kind of take into account this new research from sciences about the way in which reasoning and emotional faculties are actually working together rather than in opposition. So, and that kind of raises further questions about whether perhaps in epistemological sense, we miss a lot if we are emotionally closed off. And so the reason why we don't do the right things is perhaps because we're just not open in the right way emotionally. So that's kind of I want to work more on. So the circumstances under which we can say that we are emotionally better equipped to deal with the ethical issues, because we know that emotions are motivating, just like desires, but what makes emotion appropriate, what makes our emotional response the right one? It's not the same, like if we have a belief, then belief can be false or true, but emotions are more mysterious, more unique, kind of mental state. Some philosophers who work on the philosophy of emotions would not even still now recognize that, the emotion is a third category, in addition to two types of mental states, namely beliefs and desires. So some philosophers will say, well, emotion is just maybe perhaps a combination of the both, both. But my way of thinking is that emotion is a third category, and although it is challenging to carve out that region that we call emotion, ultimately it is a sui generis kind of mental state. So that's my kind of, if you like, theory of emotion that I work with when I approach these questions in ethics.
No, I don't know many people who subscribe to it. In fact, to be honest, I think I've only ever met one. But I've got to ask you about emotivism here. B.F. Skinner, I believe it is. The idea that morals and ethics are just an emotional reaction. When you're saying that murder is wrong, you're basically just saying, boo, murder. What do you think about that?
So emotivism is the original kind of the original form of non-cognitivism. So non-cognitivists argue that that moral judgments are non-cognitive states, typically desires and emotions. And A.J. Ayer is the proponent of this kind of a school of non-cognitivist, emotivist school that kind of makes sense of the motivational story, because then if you subscribe to that kind of theory, then you are better equipped to explain moral motivation. Nonetheless, and cognitivists who argue that moral judgments are beliefs have more difficulties with explaining the nature of moral motivation, because ordinary beliefs don't typically motivate us. So if moral judgments are beliefs, what makes them so special? What makes them different from ordinary beliefs? But cognitivists, I think, have an upper hand in accounting for the objectivity of moral thought, from the fact that we have and continue to converge on certain ideas. The nature of this disagreement, moral disagreement, drives us more towards realism, towards cognitivism, etc. And also, as the non-cognitivism and cognitivism debate, cognitivism debate has developed, more and more philosophers are gravitating towards cognitivism and Timothy Hogan, for example, is a philosopher who calls his philosophy cognitivism, cognitivist emotivism or something like that. So, in other words, the new non-cognitivists, and that includes Simon Blackburn, for example, they are trying to accommodate or incorporate some ideas that cognitivists have put forward in order to improve on what is otherwise the initial, a stage of non-cognitivist development, namely the Ayer's emotivism, which has met, several objections.
Yeah, it seems a little mad to me that my objection to child abuse would be just an emotional reaction. It's nothing wrong with it. I'm just getting emotional about it. It's just my personal dislike. Yeah, I'd really struggle to reconcile that with the real actual world we live in. But I know we could talk about ethics and this all day. I want to make sure I give some due time to your work on philosophy of mind as well. Something
Yes.
a little closer to my world. But if you have
But
something to
if I
add,
could just
go ahead.
interrupt you,
Yeah.
so I mean, but that is what you say is consistent with cognitivism. So if you see, child abuse, this is how you respond introspectively. You know very well that this is your emotional response. But then, like I said before, doesn't that just tell us something about the cognitive aspect of emotion itself? It's not all about subjective feeling. Emotions might have, sometimes or even often misguide us, but ultimately they can be appropriately identifying their object, in this case, the abuse. So it is not just that you have this response. There is a reason why you have this response, because your emotions are, in this case, guiding rather than misguiding.
Yeah.
Sorry, I
Okay.
just wanted to.
No, that's very good. That's very good. Yeah, I mean, I did a theology degree and I did a theology master's, but I haven't spent a lot of time in ethics outside of that.
Mhm.
And it's hard to sort of break down what's instinctive and really understand it. But this is why everyone should do a bit of ethics as
Yeah.
part of their philosophy training.
Mhm.
Everyone should do some philosophy of mind as well. And you've brought up neuroscience as well quite a lot, which is
Yeah.
informing a lot of your research, which is wonderful. I love where
Mhm.
these things converge. So please tell us a bit more about your work on philosophy of mind and your areas of research.
Well, like many philosophers, and I think Alex Carter in the other podcast mentioned that too. A lot of philosophers start by this kind of being enchanted or puzzled by the Cartesian philosophy, which is so important as a starting point, I think, for anyone interested in philosophy of mind, and at the same time, so objectionable. And the cogito itself, I think therefore exist, is subject to lots of objections, including the question whether it's includes fallacy, for example. Just because it is true that my thinking is the essence of my existence, it may not follow that that an entity that doesn't exist doesn't think. But that's just a very brief illustration of these kind of continuous debates about the merits and disadvantages of Cartesian philosophy. The key problem, obviously, is the interactionist problem. If, as Descartes thought, mind and body are separate existences, then what explains their interaction, and so on. So there are lots of reasons to move beyond Cartesian dualism and subscribe to something like perhaps property dualism. But property dualism is not really satisfying when we think about just the issue with location. So you're just locating problem somewhere else, which is the relation between properties. Okay, so if it's not the substance, then it's how the properties of, the mental and material and immaterial properties interact. So that doesn't seem satisfying. Then we move on to something like epiphenomenalism, according to which, we shouldn't deny the existence of mental properties. It's just that they don't have causal traction. Well, why are you in the business of talking about it? Why? What's the point of talking about something like mind if mind doesn't really have any causal role to play? So the monist positions are, I think, something that might be comparatively more plausible, but how to articulate this monist position is it's a very complex question. What I would like to stay away from, and I think that is unlikely that I will stray in that direction, is the physicalist, the kind of this ultimate physicalist position, the place occupied by philosophers such as Churchlands, Paul and Patricia Churchland, who have this kind of very attractive idea that the mind, as we conceive of it, it doesn't really exist. So we talk about mind because it helps us navigate our way through the world, but actually it's just a psychological concept that we're going to eventually have to get rid of because the science will explain everything, including kind of this puzzle, just like the science can explain now why our conception of witches was misguided, something like that. And I think that is the devastating prospect. And why it's devastating? Because it will just not answer the question of meaning. What things mean for us is one thing, and what the thing is quite another. In other words, we can have this explanatory level, physicalist level. They can have all of that. You scientists should be credited for doing your job. But that will still leave the question about what things mean for us, separate from these kind of possible achievements on the scientific or philosophically scientific level. So, so that's kind of a brief overview of how I see the mind and consciousness. As you could probably gather, I haven't made up my mind. So I know you asked me very kind of specific question that unfortunately I'm not in a position to give you articulate full-fledged answer to, other than saying it's somewhere between property dualism and monism.
Well, if I can press you on what you might expect the outcome to be when it comes to consciousness, there seem to be two extremes, if I can call them extremes. On the one hand, there's the expectation that consciousness will just end up being an emergent phenomena from a byproduct of physical processes. And maybe the emergent phenomena is mind or is ultimately physical. I'm quite skeptical on that. But basically, it's just a byproduct, an emergent property. Or the other side, consciousness is fundamental to the universe. And you end up perhaps in a panpsychism position, much like Philip Goff or others in the past, including Arthur Eddington, who I did my doctorate on, that the consciousness is the fundamental background to reality. So, I mean, I'm not asking you to pick a camp, but where would you place yourself, maybe, and what do you expect the answer will end up being?
In the former camp, that the consciousness is the emergent property. And although I'm very much I have very much sort of not intellectual affinity, but I recognize the how powerful that kind of argument given by Philip Goff and Galen Strawson about panpsychist argument. I recognize the intellectual pull towards that kind of argument because it just kind of offers this holistic picture. You can't just split the universe into, oh, here is consciousness, and now kind of in this stone, there isn't that kind of thing. So it is very attractive as a position, but only intellectually, I think. A different kind of intuitions drive us also. And I think, and reasoning processes. So I'm more inclined to think that perhaps the consciousness understood as an emergent property is more likely.
Interesting. I don't know where to end up, but I'm very skeptical of the idea that consciousness, I get more skeptical by the idea that consciousness could be explained purely by physical processes.
Yeah.
Or how you could test or measure it being a emergent property. We have no idea what thoughts are. If we're talking about the redness of an apple, I can't cut up a bit of the grey mush in my head and point at it and go, that's where the thought of the redness of an apple is. It's if I talk about a pair of mice wearing leather jackets juggling cheese, we can picture that in our heads, but there's no gene sequence or quantum fluctuation or epiphenomenal sort of epigenetic sort of thing, like cellular process. I can say that's the code for thinking about two mice wearing leather jackets juggling cheese. That's it. It's so I'm very skeptical on that front, but you're the expert. Do you think we're quite close or still a long way away from finding an answer?
Finding an answer to the question of what consciousness is.
Yeah, the hard problem of consciousness.
No, I don't think that we will ever solve that problem, and I don't think we should.
Could you elaborate on that?
We can approximate it better because, like with everything, we keep moving in some kind of direction, whether we can call it progress. Some philosophers don't even believe in progress. But we keep moving, and we are reformulating, reshaping them. We obviously know much more than we used to, thanks to sciences, not just philosophy. But we might just rethink and reconceptualize, and in order to just make sense of what we learned. So we will learn more, and then we have to make sense of whatever it is that we learn. And we will call it, this is consciousness.
Are there any other big, open, interesting questions in philosophy of mind that you look forward to or have piqued your interest?
So one of my research projects is on happiness, the nature of happiness. It's such a kind of widely discussed topic. And one of the reasons that I'm interested in that phenomena is that there is so much around that seems to be conflation between related phenomena such as well-being, flourishing, welfare, and so on. And these terms are sometimes used implausibly, interchangeably, and not just in philosophy, but in areas such as policy making and health institutions And I think that just, we as philosophers have a job to do, which is, and has been, a lot has been written, that I much admire. Fred Feldman's book on, happiness, for example, which attempts to disentangle these, concepts that I've just mentioned. And my position is that somehow not many philosophers think that happiness is an emotion. Some, but not very few. And this is my way of approaching the topic, that in order to make sense of that very phenomena called happiness, we need to distinguish it from attitudes, for example. So if I ask you, are you happy? Then you might go through your mind and think like, well, I've achieved this, I've done that, so my attitude is positive. But what you're telling me is that you should essentially be happy. But it's a further question whether you really are. Then you need to ask yourself, but do I really feel happy? And so then if you feel happy, even though you don't think you deserve happiness, then it seems, well, happiness could be just a feeling. Or if you think you have reasons to be happy, then you have a sense of well-being. But well-being is not happiness, and so on and so forth. And so the way that I think about these issues is to characterize happiness as an emotion. And like with every other emotion, if you subscribe to this idea that that emotion is combination of thought and feeling, they cannot be separated and pulled apart, then you would also have to accept that happiness cannot equate to sort of Aristotelian flourishing, because that is just thinking without necessarily feeling.
That's really interesting, and I really like that.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's another example of studying philosophy and researching philosophy that everyone can engage with, and is so current and real world in its application, universal. So I'd like to give you the floor here just to make your case as to why young people and older people should study philosophy academically, or at least read more of it.
Yes, so I will briefly mention Stephen Law again, because in that book that I mentioned, The War for Children's Minds, he, amongst other things, mentioned the fact that in Australia, children are taught philosophy at an earlier stage and age, and that kind of is important because it's they're well placed to develop their critical thinking skills. They better placed to face some kind of things later in life that, unless you're kind of philosophically minded, you're struggling. I struggle because I worked on books. I worked with lots of politicians, and I regularly attended sort of meetings. I went to House of Lords and House of Commons, but I was always I just could not believe how much nonsense is being said and accepted.
Yes.
How much nonsense people accept uncritically without questioning, accepting the conclusions without questioning the premises that lead to this conclusion. And so I wish, in that sense, I studied philosophy much earlier, because the sooner you start kind of confronting these things, the better you're equipped to be a better voter, for example. As citizens, we should take responsibility for what we vote for. But voting ultimately, the quality of your vote, and I'm not very democratic about, I'm afraid to say, that everybody's vote has equal weight. But ultimately we have responsibility for voting well, and which it in turns requires us to be at least a little bit philosophically minded. So to that extent, yes, I think that, there is a reason for everyone to study philosophy, at least a little bit.
That's very good. Yeah, and we know Plato and Socrates weren't big fans of democracy. They just thought
So,
the philosophers should rule the world, and maybe they're onto something.
Yes. And I had a recent conversation with another, excellent philosopher at Reading University, Professor David Oderberg, about this, who I'm relieved when I speak with people like him who are also not very receptive to this the value of democracies, something that we should necessarily worship.
Yeah, it definitely, yeah. Oh, well, we won't get into that here, I think, not at this point. But if people want to know, yeah, if people want to know more about you or find your research and or if they want to know more about studying at Oxford or Cambridge,
Yes.
where you teach, where should they go?
It's very easy to find me on the main web page of continuing education as a tutor. And obviously I have the Academia EDU site where you can see my published work. And then also a little bit on Cambridge University also. There is a link to my profile on their department or Institute for Continuing Education. So it's very easy to find me.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I've loved working with you, and I'm looking forward to doing so again next year. And thank you for taking your time out to speak to us today about philosophy. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Sam. It's been really, really great pleasure.
Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Stay tuned for more amazing conversations with incredible researchers who are changing the world we live in and driving humanity forward. Feel free to check out my Instagram at polymath_Sam or go to my website at www.sam-McKee.co.uk.